The marble was cold, freezing even, so highly polished it reflected the light from the crystal chandeliers like a mirror, and right there, on that immaculate surface, a white china plate was placed. Not with care, not gently, but thrown. The clatter echoed down the mansion's empty hallway, a sharp ring that sounded almost like a slap in the face. Frail hands, deeply scarred by time and back-breaking labor, clutched a crust of bread. Hands that trembled slightly, not exactly from fear, but from something far deeper, raw humiliation perhaps, or absolute resignation. The elderly woman was on her knees, her joints, already aching from age, pressed hard against the freezing marble floor. Her gray hair fell across her face, partially hiding eyes that glistened with unshed tears. And then came the voice. Young, feminine, dripping with a venom that polite diction completely failed to mask. "That's right. This is where you belong. Now eat." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Worse, it was a test. A sick display of power over someone who had absolutely no way to fight back. Towering over the kneeling woman stood someone else. Younger, maybe half her age, wearing clothes that cost more than a working-class family makes in a month. Makeup applied with surgical precision, a flawless, salon-perfect blowout, and on her face, an expression that perfectly blended pure disgust with twisted satisfaction. The kind of look someone gets when they feel like a god and want to make damn sure the other person knows it. Victoria watched the scene she had orchestrated with something dangerously close to pleasure. It was power, pure and simple, the intoxicating high of making another human being crawl, of turning someone's dignity to absolute ash, and she was loving every single second of it. But then, something shifted. The mansion's front doors, massive hand-carved solid oak, were shoved open with a force that made the heavy hinges groan. Firm footsteps echoed across the grand foyer. Male footsteps, heavy and decisive. The kind of stride that belonged to someone used to giving orders, to being obeyed, to commanding the room. Richard stopped dead in the archway between the foyer and the hall. His bespoke Italian suit didn't have a single crease out of place. His posture was that of a man who had built a corporate empire from the ground up and knew exactly what his time was worth. But when his eyes processed the scene in front of him, the elderly woman on her knees, the plate on the floor, his wife towering over her, something in his face completely froze. Victoria spun around, and in that split second, her face morphed. The sneering superiority vanished, instantly replaced by sheer blinding panic. Her entire body went rigid. She opened her mouth, but not a single sound came out. Because she knew. She knew she had been caught red-handed. She knew the flawless mask she wore so carefully for her husband had just shattered on the floor, and Richard, still paralyzed in the archway, still struggling to process what he was seeing, whispered a single word, a word loaded with shock, deep confusion, and a dark rage just starting to boil. "Mom?" But to understand how we got here, to truly grasp the sickening cruelty of the situation and everything that was on the line, we need to rewind the clock. We need to find out who these people really are and what dragged them into this terrifying collision. Victoria wasn't born into money, but she learned how to fake it early on. She hadn't married Richard out of love, but pure opportunism. He was everything she ever craved. Old money, elite status, an estate in the Hamptons that made her friends violently jealous. And she, in return, had molded herself into the ultimate trophy wife. At least, whenever he was looking. Whenever Richard was home, Victoria was all beaming smiles and grace. She treated the staff with rehearsed politeness, hosted flawless dinner parties, and played the perfect hostess who knew exactly how to charm her husband's wealthy board members. But Richard traveled constantly. His acquisitions kept him overseas for weeks on end, and it was during those stretches that Victoria's true, ugly face broke through. She absolutely despised the staff. She didn't just view them as beneath her. She had a sick need to constantly remind them of it. It was as if grinding people into the dirt was the only way she could feel genuinely powerful. The older housekeepers were her favorite targets. Exhausted, aging women who desperately needed the paycheck and swallowed vicious insults that no human being should ever have to stomach. Victoria would make them scrub the exact same baseboards 3-4 times in a row, just because she could. She nitpicked every tiny detail with a malice that went way beyond high standards. She would conveniently forget to sign their checks, just to watch them beg for their wages. And she always made it crystal clear that they were lucky to even breathe the air in her house, that they could be replaced in a heartbeat, that they were absolute nobodies. She was the kind of predator who measured her own self-worth by her ability to make others feel microscopic. And the more vulnerable the victim, the bigger the high she got. That was the toxic environment Martha walked into. It was a Thursday morning, right after Victoria had posted a listing for a new private chef. The previous one had walked out in tears after enduring 3 months of psychological abuse. Martha rang the doorbell exactly at 9 a.m., right on schedule. She was 68, but the miles on her face made her look older. A lifetime of punching the clock leaves deep scars that no expensive skin cream can cover up. Her gray hair was pulled back into a simple, no-nonsense bun. Her clothes were spotless but visibly worn out. The kind of cheap cotton basics washed so many times they'd lost their original color. She moved slowly, with the careful gait of someone whose joints screamed in pain but who had learned to just swallow it. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, measured, packed with a genuine humility born from decades of accepting the brutal hand the world had dealt her. Victoria looked Martha up and down and saw exactly what she was hunting for. Prey. Someone who would take any abuse thrown at her. Someone fragile enough to never fight back. Someone she could crush without fear of a lawsuit. She didn't even bother setting up a proper tasting menu to test her culinary skills. She asked a few condescending questions, skimmed the fake references Martha had handed over, and hired her on the spot. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody in that zip code knew, was the devastating truth about Martha. She didn't actually need the paycheck. In fact, after a lifetime of hoarding every single dime she made, she had enough tucked away in a modest index fund to live out her final years in peace. But there was a gaping hole in her chest that no amount of money could ever fix. 40 years ago, Martha had been a young, terrified, and desperate girl, pregnant, completely abandoned by the father, with zero family support, no money, and no way out. When the baby was born, a perfectly healthy little boy with huge eyes and a set of iron lungs, she held him for exactly 3 days. 3 days of weeping, nursing him, memorizing every single curve of his tiny face. And then, with her heart shattered into pieces so small they would never fit back together, she signed him over to the state for adoption. It was the most agonizing choice a human being could make. But she had no other play. She had no way to buy formula, no way to put a roof over his crib, no way to give him a fighting chance at life. The social worker promised her the boy was going to a wealthy, loving family, that he would have every opportunity in the world. And Martha signed the legal papers with hot tears smearing the blue ink, feeling like she was physically ripping her own beating heart out of her chest. The decades bled by. She busted her back, scrubbing toilets, working the graveyard shift at laundromats, sweating over greasy grills in roadside diners. Every dollar she earned, she banked half. She lived on absolute bare minimums, driven by a single obsessive goal. One day, she was going to find her son. Not to ruin his life, not to demand a relationship or a payout, but just to look at him. To know for a fact that he was okay. To know that the most traumatic decision of her life had actually bought him a golden ticket. It took years, but she finally hired a private investigator. She dumped her life savings into unsealing closed adoption records, chasing dead-end leads, kicking down doors that the system tried to keep shut. Until finally, after 4 agonizing decades, she found him, Richard. Her little boy, now a towering made man. A self-made billionaire, married, living at the absolute top of the food chain. Everything she had ever prayed for. But when she pulled up the address, when she parked her beat-up sedan outside those massive iron gates and saw the sprawling estate, Martha's courage completely evaporated. How could she, a worn-out, blue-collar old woman, just walk up to a titan of industry and announce, "I'm your birth mother"? He'd think she was a lunatic. Or worse, he'd believe her and hate her guts for abandoning him. Or even more sickening, he'd pity her. That humiliating, toxic pity that instantly murders any chance of real human connection. So she came up with a plan. A plan that bordered on insane, but it was the only angle she had left. She would infiltrate his life through the service door. She would get hired as staff. She could breathe the same air as him without ever dropping the bomb. Just to watch him exist. To verify he was truly happy. To maybe, just maybe, steal a few quiet memories before she ran out of time on this earth. That's why she forged the culinary resumes and applied for the private chef gig. That's why she rang that doorbell, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought she was going to have a stroke. And that is exactly how she voluntarily marched straight into the lion's den, right into Victoria's manicured claws. Day one was a brutal wake-up call. Victoria gave Martha a tour of the industrial kitchen, rattling off Richard's dietary quirks with a clinical coldness that showed zero actual love for her husband. Just memorized stats for a VIP client. And then, as a sick little initiation test, Victoria deliberately spilled a full glass of cranberry juice all over the spotless white tile. "Oops," Victoria purred, not a single trace of an apology in her tone. "How clumsy of me. Martha, be a doll and scrub that up for me, will you? Oh, and use the toothbrush. I want those grout lines gleaming." There was absolutely no logical reason to use a toothbrush. No reason to make the chef mop the floor when there was a literal army of maids on payroll for that exact job. It was purely sadistic, a calculated test to see exactly how much abuse Martha would swallow. And Martha, focusing her mind entirely on the son who was sleeping somewhere upstairs in that massive house, dropped to her knees without a single whisper of protest. Her arthritic joints screamed in protest, a sharp shooting pain traveling up her spine. But she grabbed the tiny brush and started scrubbing. Every single motion was agony, every second was deeply humiliating. But it was the price of admission. Because Richard was there. Her blood was under that roof. And this, in some twisted, tragic way, was the closest she was ever going to get to being his mother again. Victoria watched from above with that sickening little smirk. She had found her ultimate punching bag, and the following weeks proved it. Victoria would fabricate impossible prep tasks. She'd throw Michelin-quality steaks in the trash, claiming they were overcooked. She'd force Martha to re-chop entire stations of perfectly diced vegetables, and she always used that razor-sharp, condescending tone that screamed, "You are absolute trash, and I am a queen." But Martha took the hits. Because every now and then, when Richard was actually in town, she got to see him. She'd pour his black coffee at 6 a.m. and secretly watch him read the Wall Street Journal. She'd plate his dinner and listen to the deep timbre of his voice as he closed million-dollar deals on his cell. Tiny, stolen fragments of time that she locked away in her heart like priceless diamonds. Richard was polite to her, but completely walled off. Like most guys in the 1%, he treated the help with a slick, automated corporate courtesy that required zero emotional investment. He wasn't a monster like his wife, but he didn't really see the staff either. They were just gears in his machine. Highly functional, but totally invisible. And Martha made peace with being a ghost. Because being invisible in his orbit was still infinitely better than being locked out of it. Even when Victoria dragged her through the mud, even when her lower back burned from 14-hour shifts, even when she cried herself to sleep on the cheap mattress in the servants' quarters, she held on to the lifeline. "I'm close to my boy. That has to be enough." But Victoria didn't have an off switch. Her sadism mutated daily, like a hardcore addiction that demanded heavier doses to hit the same high. She banned Martha from eating at the staff table, forcing her to eat alone facing the stainless steel fridge. She started mocking the way the old woman limped, the way she breathed, the mere fact that she took up space. And slowly, unstoppably, it was building toward an explosive climax. It happened on an afternoon when Victoria was feeling particularly bored. Richard had flown out again, this time for a 3-day tech summit in Silicon Valley. The mansion was her playground. No witnesses, no boundaries. She summoned Martha to the formal dining room and, for absolutely no reason other than pure distilled malice, chucked a dinner roll onto the hardwood floor. "Do you know what the problem is with your kind of people?" Victoria purred, her voice dripping with poison. "You actually think you deserve basic human rights just for breathing. But you don't. Respect is for winners. And people like you, well, you're just bottom feeders." She grabbed a fine china plate, the ridiculously expensive kind reserved for Thanksgiving, and dropped it on the floor next to the bread. "Let's run a little drill. You're going to eat that roll, off the floor, like the stray dog you are, and then you're going to say thank you for the meal." Martha stared at the bread, at the china plate, and then at Victoria's dead, shark-like eyes. And something inside the old woman completely snapped. Not her will to survive. She'd walk through hellfire for her boy. But her delusion that this torture had a finish line, the hope that eventually Victoria would get bored and stop. She wouldn't. Parasites like Victoria are never satisfied, because the cruelty isn't actually about the victim. It's about a gaping, rotting hole inside themselves that no amount of blood can ever fill. But Martha sank to her knees anyway, because it was the ransom she had to pay to stay in the house. to stay near Richard. She picked up the roll with violently shaking hands, the degradation burning her throat like swallowed battery acid. And that was the exact split second they heard the heavy front doors swing open. Rapid, heavy footsteps. Richard was back early. The summit had been scrapped, and he thought he'd catch an early flight to surprise his wife. But the surprise was entirely his, because when he turned the corner into the dining room and witnessed the scene, his wife standing tall, glaring down with malicious disgust, and an elderly woman on her knees with a plate on the floor, something inside his brain just stopped working. Victoria whipped around, blind panic instantly hijacking her face, and Richard, trying to run the horrific data through his mind, trying to reconcile this psychopath with the woman he married, whispered, "Mom?" But he didn't actually know. He couldn't have known. Not yet. That word slipped out because, in the blinding shock of the moment, it was the primal instinct that hijacked his tongue. The brutal image of a mother figure, of someone so painfully vulnerable, being degraded like an animal. He had absolutely no idea the terrifying, miraculous weight that word actually carried. And right there, in that frozen snapshot in time, 3 lives were about to collide at terminal velocity in ways none of them could ever survive unchanged. The following days ripped the mask completely off Victoria's true nature. With Richard back on his endless travel schedule, closing mergers out of state, the estate morphed back into a lawless dictatorship. And Martha, who thought she had already seen the rock bottom of human depravity, quickly learned that the devil always has a basement. It started with the restrooms. Victoria strutted into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, caught Martha brewing the espresso, and dropped a line in that sugary sweet voice that was vastly more terrifying than a scream. "Oh, Martha, one tiny little thing. I noticed you've been using the guest powder room in the East Wing. That stops today. You use the utility closet toilet out by the garage from now on. It's much more fitting for someone of your pedigree." The utility bathroom was a glorified closet, with zero ventilation and a permanent sickening stench of black mold that no amount of bleach could kill. It was on the absolute opposite end of the property, meaning Martha, with her inflamed, throbbing knees, had to hike across the entire estate just to use the toilet. But she just nodded, kept her eyes glued to the floor, and whispered, "Yes, ma'am." Victoria smirked, that smug, venomous smile of a predator marking its territory. But she didn't hit the brakes. She never did. The next afternoon, she barged into the kitchen during the staff lunch hour and caught Martha sitting on a bar stool, resting her swollen feet while eating a cheap bowl of soup and crackers. "Get on your feet," Victoria barked, her voice slashing like broken glass. Martha shot up instantly, nearly dropping her bowl. "Who gave you permission to put your weight on my furniture? These chairs are designed for actual people, not for—" "Well, you get the picture." She didn't have to finish the sentence. The message was loud and clear. Martha wasn't classified as human enough to deserve a seat. "From this second forward," Victoria dictated, "you eat standing up. Right there in the corner facing the fridge. And make it fast. I'm not paying you to stand around chewing." Eating standing up. At 68 years old, with a spine that burned from decades of manual labor, with kneecaps that felt like they were packed with shards of glass every time she shifted her weight. But Martha swallowed her pride and nodded. Because fighting back meant getting fired. And getting fired meant having the only lifeline to her son permanently severed. So she ate right there, shoved in the shadows by the ice maker, balancing a cheap plastic bowl in one hand and a spoon in the other. She inhaled the food, barely chewing, choking it down like an inmate. And she could always feel Victoria's dead eyes burning into the back of her skull whenever she floated past the kitchen, making damn sure her tyrannical rules were being followed to the letter, ensuring the poison was sinking deep. But the universe occasionally has a savage sense of timing. Richard swung by the estate unannounced for lunch on a Thursday. He had a massive board meeting downtown, and figured he'd drop in, see his wife, and grab a real home-cooked meal instead of the overpriced, soulless garbage they served at the country club. Victoria was caught completely off guard. She was up in the master suite getting glammed up for a mimosa brunch with her toxic friends when she heard the heavy oak doors slam downstairs. Her pulse spiked. She practically sprinted down the sweeping staircase, plastering on that billion-dollar Stepford wife smile. "Honey, what a gorgeous surprise." Richard kissed her cheek absently, already ripping his silk tie loose. "Decided to eat at home today. I was craving something real." He marched straight into the formal dining room, dropped into the massive head chair and called out, "Martha, could you plate lunch for me, please?" Bile rose in Victoria's throat. She had to lock the narrative down instantly. She glided into the kitchen where Martha was already shaking, aggressively plating a roasted tenderloin. "You are going to walk out there and act completely normal," Victoria hissed, her manicured nails digging into the granite counter. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your eyes glued to the floor. Are we clear?" Martha nodded, but her hands were trembling so violently the silverware rattled. 'Cause sitting right out there, just a few feet away, was her flesh and blood. The boy she had pushed out, nursed in the dark for 3 miserable days, and hunted for 4 decades. And she wasn't even allowed to look him in the eye without triggering a war. She pushed through the swinging doors carrying the heavy silver platter. Richard glanced up from his iPhone, flashing that polite, automated CEO smile. "Thanks, Martha." She lowered the plate in front of him, shaking so hard the fork loudly clanked against the fine china. Victoria stood right behind her husband's chair, arms crossed, eyes narrowed into predatory slits. Richard took a bite, and his exhausted face genuinely lit up. "My God, this is incredible. Seriously, I haven't had a pot roast this good since I was a kid." He looked up at Martha, who was still frozen in place, nervously wringing her hands together. "How long have you been on the payroll?" It was a basic throwaway question. But for Martha, the earth stopped spinning on its axis. Her boy was talking to her, looking directly at her, waiting to hear her voice. Her eyes instantly flooded with heavy tears before she could choke them down. "3 months, sir," she stammered, her voice shattering halfway through. Richard caught the tears and his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Are you all right?" But before Martha could even open her mouth, Victoria jumped in with that lethal, practiced corporate efficiency. "She's just overwhelmed by the compliment, babe. Martha takes her cooking very, very seriously." Victoria's tone was breezy, but there was razor wire hiding underneath, a sick, coded threat that only Martha could decipher. "Shut your mouth." "Isn't that right, Martha? You can head back to the kitchen now. We still need that dessert prepped." Martha backed out of the room instantly, but not before stealing one final desperate glance at Richard. And in that microscopic fraction of a second, an invisible current passed between them. It wasn't recognition. How could he recognize a ghost he'd never seen? But it was something. A strange magnetic gravity that left Richard staring blankly at the swinging kitchen doors long after she was gone. "She looks completely broken," Richard murmured, turning back to Victoria. "Are you treating her all right?" Victoria laughed. That bubbly, musical laugh she had practiced in the mirror for years. "Of course, baby. I spoil her rotten, honestly. You know how these older women get, they're just super emotional." She aggressively hijacked the conversation, pivoting to their weekend itinerary, the charity gala they were sponsoring. Literally anything to drag his radar off the weeping maid. But Richard couldn't shake it. Throughout the entire meal, his brain kept flashing back to those wet, haunted eyes, to an abyss of grief that went way deeper than a simple kitchen compliment. There was a phantom frequency there he couldn't quite tune into, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing on his chest that refused to lift. Victoria noticed, and it made her blood boil. How the hell did this piece of trash servant dare hijack Richard's focus? How dared she forge this sickening bond, no matter how invisible it was? It had to be exterminated. Immediately. The very next morning, Richard caught a private jet for another run. 3 days in D.C., locking horns with lobbyists and tech investors. And the absolute second his black SUV cleared the estate gates, Victoria activated a scorched earth campaign to reclaim her throne. She texted her inner circle for a brunch. 5 women just as filthy rich, just as chronically bored, and just as sociopathic beneath their layers of Botox and designer labels. They rolled up in G-Wagons, dripping in diamonds that cost more than Martha's entire life insurance policy. They hijacked the dining room, filling the air with screeching laughter, overpowering Chanel perfume, and toxic gossip about anyone they deemed too poor to exist. Martha carried out the charcuterie, the imported salads, the main courses. Her hands were shaking violently, not just from exhaustion, but from a gut-wrenching dread. Victoria was vibrating on a different frequency today. There was a manic, evil gleam in her eyes, a hunger for a slaughter that was about to go down. And her circle of vipers sensed it, exchanging loaded glances, smirking like a pack of wolves smelling fresh blood in the snow. The execution happened during the wine service. Martha was physically spent. Her grip strength was failing. As she tilted the heavy Napa Valley Cabernet over one of the women's crystal glasses, her wrist buckled. Just a millimeter. But it was game over. The dark red wine splashed over the rim, bleeding into the imported white linen tablecloth like a gunshot wound. The silence that followed was deafening. The gossip flatlined. 5 heads snapped toward the spill. Martha froze, the heavy bottle still suspended in her hand, absolute terror paralyzing her face. I am so sorry, she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. It was an accident. I'll get the club soda right now. You stupid, incompetent trash. Victoria's voice detonated like a flashbang. She vaulted out of her chair so aggressively it crashed onto the hardwood. Her face flushed bright red, not from real anger but from a highly calculated theatrical performance. She was putting on a show, proving to her vicious little court that she owned her castle, that she owned the peasants in it. You literally cannot do a single basic task right. Nothing. The women watched, some faking shock, others sporting a dead-eyed glint that exposed a deep, morbid thrill. Victoria marched up to Martha and physically ripped the bottle from her arthritic grip. Since you clearly lack the motor skills to stand near a dining table, since you act like a clumsy, uneducated animal, you're going to eat like one. What went down next was a level of pure, distilled psychological warfare that felt ripped from a nightmare. Victoria stormed into the kitchen, grabbed Martha's cheap plastic bowl, the meager scraps the old woman hadn't even had a chance to touch yet, and carried it back into the formal dining room. Right in front of her high society audience, right in front of bystanders who could have stopped it but chose to grab popcorn, Victoria slammed the bowl onto the floor. Not gently, violently. The plastic smacked the marble with a crack that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Right there! Victoria aimed a manicured finger at the floor. That's your territory. You eat down there in the dirt exactly like the stray dog you are. Martha stood completely paralyzed. Her kneecaps were shaking so violently she could barely keep herself upright. Heavy, silent tears carved rivers down her weathered face. She scanned the women sitting at the feast, desperately searching for a shred of empathy, a flicker of humanity, someone to throw her a rope. But all she found were smirks, cruel, muffled giggles hidden behind manicured hands, the sickening thrill of the Colosseum. One of the wives whispered a joke to the girl next to her, and they both snickered. Another slowly slid her iPhone out of her Prada bag, actually considering recording it for the group chat. And Victoria, basking in the center spotlight, was practically glowing. She had just cemented her absolute dominance, proved she could crush anyone's windpipe whenever she pleased, and nobody would ever step in to stop her. I am losing my patience, Victoria snapped, crossing her arms. Or do you want me to fire you on the spot? Because I can make one phone call right now and guarantee you'll be sleeping under a bridge by nightfall. Is your blood boiling at this scene? Then smash that like button right now to prove you stand with the billionaire's mother and against this sickening arrogance. Martha stared down at the bowl on the floor, her mind locked onto Richard. She thought about her boy, completely oblivious to her existence, totally unaware that the broken woman chopping his vegetables was the one who gave him breath. If she walked out those front doors right now, she would never see his face again, never hear his voice. And that reality, as soul-crushing as it was, hurt 1,000,000 times worse than getting on her knees, moving in agonizing slow motion, as if every inch was physically shredding her soul. Martha began to lower herself. Her brittle knees hit the freezing marble. Her trembling palms braced against the floor, and the giggling from the peanut gallery dialed up. A sick, twisted applause celebrating the complete execution of another human being's dignity. She was inches from dropping her face to the floor when she heard it. Footsteps, rapid, thunderous, storming down the hallway. The dining room door was kicked open with such explosive violence it punched a hole in the drywall, and there, standing in the doorway like the Grim Reaper, his face forged into a mask of pure, homicidal rage, was Richard. He had circled back. He forgot a classified legal folder and forced the driver to turn the SUV around. And he walked in at the exact perfect millisecond to witness the entire slaughter. His eyes scanned the carnage, the rich housewives freezing like deer in headlights, the bowl on the floor, and Martha on her hands and knees, hot tears splashing onto the marble beneath her. And then his eyes locked onto Victoria. And in that stare, there was a darkness she had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was total, absolute disgust. Pure revulsion. The instant, catastrophic demolition of any shred of respect he ever held for her. What the hell, he murmured, his voice lethally low and vibrating with danger, is going on in here? The dining room plunged into a morgue-like silence. Victoria's clique darted their eyes from Richard to her, down to Martha still glued to the floor, terrified of the nuclear fallout about to drop. Victoria opened her mouth, clamped it shut and opened it again. For the first time in her pampered life, the Queen had absolutely zero lines to read. Richard crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He blew past the table of socialites like they didn't even exist. He stopped right beside Martha and, with a tenderness that violently clashed with the murder in his eyes, offered her his hand. "Get up, please." Martha took his hand, the hand of the boy she birthed, and dragged herself up. Her legs were buckling. Richard instantly anchored her, gripping her elbow firmly but gently until he knew she wasn't going to collapse. Then, he pivoted to his wife. "Your little friends," he stated, every syllable carved out of dry ice, "are leaving right now. You and I are going to have a chat. A very long, very dark chat about the atrocity I just walked into." The housewives didn't need a second warning. They snatched their Birkin bags, muttered pathetic excuses, and scrambled out the front door like rats fleeing a sinking ship. In under 2 minutes, the estate was a tomb again, leaving only Richard, Victoria, and Martha in the blast zone. Richard looked back at the elderly woman. "Martha, please, go to your room and lie down. You're off the clock for the rest of the day." His tone was soft, fiercely protective. Martha just nodded, physically unable to speak, and shuffled away quickly, her uneven footsteps fading down the long hallway. Martha never got the bloody details of what went down between Richard and Victoria, but she heard the shockwaves. The mansion's thick walls muffled most of the noise, but not all of it. Richard's voice, usually a cool, calculated baritone, was detonating with unchecked fury. Victoria's voice was shrieking, desperately trying to spin, gaslight, and backtrack. And then dead silence. A suffocating quiet that felt way heavier than any screaming match. Martha was huddled on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters when she made the final call. She couldn't do this anymore. Even with Richard playing hero, even with the faint hope that the abuse might stop, she was completely broken. The degradation had just been too brutal. Watching those rich wives cackle while she kissed the dirt, feeling the ice-cold marble scrape her knees, knowing she had let herself be stripped of her basic humanity, it was a weight she simply couldn't carry anymore. She pulled her duffel bag out. She didn't own much. A few basic uniforms, a toothbrush, 1 pair of beaten-up sneakers. Everything fit perfectly into the cheap frayed bag she had hauled around for decades. Her hands shook violently as she folded each shirt, hot tears silently soaking into the cheap cotton. But just as she was zipping it up, she heard it. High heels clicking down the back hallway, and Victoria barking into her cell phone. Loudly, very deliberately loud. "Yeah, Mom, Richard's flying out this weekend. The DC summit got pushed back. He'll be gone for 3 whole days. I'll have the whole estate to myself. Well, not totally alone. I'll have the help to keep me entertained." The way she spat the word help was loaded with toxic waste, and Martha instantly translated the coded threat. Victoria was firing a warning shot. Richard was leaving. And the absolute second his jet took off, she was reclaiming her throne. And there was going to be biblical hell to pay for embarrassing her in front of her country club clique. Martha collapsed onto her cot, the air knocked out of her lungs. 3 days. 72 hours locked in a cage with Victoria, with 0 witnesses and 0 protection. The thought made her stomach curdle. But at the same exact time, a tiny, stubborn whisper echoed in her brain. 3 days. 3 days before he leaves. 3 more days to look at him, to breathe his air, to stockpile the very last memories before you walk away forever. Because she knew this was the end of the line. There was no surviving the fallout. But maybe, just maybe, she could endure one last ride. She could scrape together enough grit to at least say a silent goodbye, even if Richard never had a clue he was looking at his own mother. She unzipped the duffel and started unpacking the folded shirts, sliding them back into the rickety dresser. She had made her bed. Just a few more days. Just a few more. But Victoria wasn't the type to sit on her hands. Early the next morning, way before Richard came down for his coffee, she barged into Martha's tiny room without knocking. The older woman was half-dressed and scrambled to cover herself, her heart leaping into her throat at the ambush. "We need to have a little chat," Victoria stated, deadbolting the door behind her. Her face was a frozen mask, but there was something venomous swimming in her eyes, something highly calculated. "About yesterday." Martha clutched her uniform to her chest, physically unable to form a word. Victoria stalked forward, aggressively invading her personal space, backing the old woman up until her spine hit the dry wall. "Richard is incredibly pissed at me right now. Victoria hissed, her voice a low, lethal hum. "Beyond pissed, and that is entirely on you. You engineered that little stunt. If you had just shut up and done your damn job properly, none of this would have gone down." I didn't mean," Martha stammered, but Victoria sliced her off with a vicious wave of her hand. "I don't give a damn what you meant. Here is how the New World Order works. You are going to stay right here, do your job, and keep your mouth permanently zipped. You will be polite, you will be submissive, and above all, you will be totally invisible. You will not breathe a single word to my husband. No whining, no crying, no playing the pathetic victim to siphon his pity." Martha shook her head, terrified. "But I never said a word to him." "And you never will," Victoria snapped, leaning in so close Martha could smell her mint toothpaste. "Because if you even look at him wrong, if you try to paint me as the villain to my own husband, I will bury you. I will obliterate your entire existence." She took a step back, crossed her arms, and dropped her tone into an icy calm that was 10 times more terrifying than a screaming fit. "I have a very expensive piece of jewelry, a vintage emerald necklace that belonged to Richard's grandmother. It's insured for 6 figures. If you open your mouth, that necklace is going to mysteriously vanish, and I am going to tell the cops that the desperate poor maid pawned it." The absolute horror on Martha's face was sickening. "I would never, I swear I'm not a thief." "I know you're not," Victoria smirked, flashing a demonic grin. "But who the hell is going to believe you? A broke, uneducated cleaning lady with zero leverage. Against me, the flawless wife of a billionaire CEO. Who do you think the detectives are going to side with? Who do you think Richard is going to believe?" The words landed like lead weights, because Victoria was dead right. Martha knew the brutal reality of the system. In a shootout between a maid's word and a socialite's tears, the maid takes the bullet every single time. That's just how the machine operated. That's how it had always been. "Besides," Victoria added, casually inspecting her French manicure with engineered boredom, "if you catch a grand larceny felony, your record is permanently torched. You'll never get a job scrubbing a gas station toilet again. You will literally die on the pavement, rotting and alone. Is that the hill you want to die on?" Martha's knees completely gave out. She slid down the wall just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Victoria drank in the utter defeat before driving the final nail in the coffin. "So here is the play. You stay, you cook, you keep your trap shut. And when Richard gets back from DC, you are going to be standing right there, smiling, playing the perfect, grateful little servant. Do we have a deal?" Martha couldn't even formulate a syllable. She just gave a broken nod, the tears spilling over her eyelashes. Victoria beamed, a look of absolute psychotic triumph, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut, sounding exactly like a heavy iron cell door locking into place. Martha shattered, physically and mentally. She crumpled against the baseboards, pulling her knees into her chest, weeping with a guttural raw agony that tore out of her throat. She was trapped in a flawless nightmare. She couldn't run away, because she'd lose her boy forever. She couldn't cry for help, because she'd be framed for a felony. Her only option was to bleed in silence. The following days were the darkest chapter of her entire existence. Victoria, having secured her absolute dictatorship via blackmail, treated Martha with a terrifying clinical coldness. No more screaming matches because Richard was still in the house, but a relentless barrage of psychological sniper fire that left 0 visible bruises. A nasty jab about her smell, a sneer of disgust when passing in the hall. Pointless, degrading chores ordered in a mockingly sweet baby voice. And Martha swallowed every single bullet without a sound, because she had a gun to her head. She turned into a literal ghost haunting her own life, drifting through the sprawling estate, executing her tasks on pure, numb autopilot, refusing to make eye contact with anyone out of sheer terror that they'd see the agony bleeding out of her. At night, barricaded inside her tiny servant's room, she wept. She cried so hard her ribs ached, vibrating with an exhaustion so deep she couldn't even pass out. And on one of those pitch-black nights, when the suffocating loneliness was just too crushing to survive, she unlocked her flimsy nightstand drawer and pulled out the one secret she kept buried. A Polaroid. Faded, yellowed by the decades, the edges completely frayed from being thumbed 1,000,000 times. It was a picture of a baby. Just a few days old, swaddled tight in a powder blue blanket that Martha had stitched together herself. The newborn's eyes were sealed shut, his face impossibly peaceful, one tiny fist tucked right up against his cheek. It was Richard, her boy. The only physical proof she had that he ever existed. Snapped in the maternity ward right before the ink dried on the surrender papers. A sympathetic nurse, shattered by Martha's absolute devastation, had illegally taken the photo and slipped it into her pocket on her way out. "So you never forget his face," the nurse had whispered. As if Martha could ever wipe him from her mind. She crushed the Polaroid against her chest, violent sobs racking her frail frame. "I'm so sorry," she choked out to the glossy paper. "Forgive me for giving you away. Forgive me for being so weak. Forgive me for standing right next to you, breathing the same air and being too damn cowardly to tell you who I am." Because that was the most brutal paradox of it all. She was living inside his fortress. She saw him 24/7. She grilled his steaks, poured his scotch, stood inches away from him. But simultaneously, she was stranded on a different planet, blocked out by an impenetrable wall of lies and social class that she could never, ever tear down. And now, with Victoria's felony blackmail hanging over her head like a guillotine, that wall seemed completely indestructible. Even if she somehow swallowed her fear, threw herself at Richard's feet and screamed, "I am your mother," the toxic seed of doubt would always be there. What if he called security? What if he thought she was a psychotic stalker, or worse, a con artist trying to extort a billionaire? And what if Victoria pulled the trigger? What if she filed the grand larceny charges? Would Richard side with the maid spinning insane fairy tales about being his birth mother? Or would he back his gorgeous high society wife who he shared a bed with every night? Martha already knew the answer, and that reality completely annihilated her. She slid the Polaroid back under her Bible, collapsed onto the lumpy mattress and prayed for sleep. But her brain wouldn't shut off. Just pure, radiating agony. Just the suffocating, crushing isolation of a woman surrounded by a dozen people, but completely, irreversibly alone. And across the compound in the sprawling master suite, Victoria was sleeping like a baby. Because she had won the war, she had locked in absolute dominance. And nobody, literally nobody on earth had the firepower to strip her of her crown. Or at least that's what her arrogant mind believed. Richard wasn't supposed to be in that zip code. He had FaceTimed earlier, confirming the DC summit was dragging out until Sunday night, and he wouldn't touch down until Monday morning. But a gnawing, toxic anxiety he couldn't shake, a weird static in his gut, forced him to bail on the closing keynote and charter a red-eye flight back to the East Coast. It was pushing 10 p.m. when he unlocked the heavy front doors. Dead quiet. A bizarre, suffocating silence, the kind that feels like it's burying a body. Usually at this hour, Victoria would be camped out in the media room binging Bravo or scrolling Instagram. But the couches were empty. The massive OLED screen was black. He ripped off his tie, dropped his leather briefcase on the marble entryway, and walked toward the kitchen wing. The overhead LEDs were on, and he heard voices. Actually, just one voice. Victoria's voice, but dialed into a frequency he didn't recognize. Sharper, harder, vibrating with a venom he had never heard her use. Pure, psychotic cruelty. Richard crept up to the swinging door, and the scene waiting on the other side completely froze the blood in his veins. Victoria was standing dead center on the imported tile, arms crossed, her face twisted into a demonic sneer of total superiority. And right there on the floor, on her hands and knees with a plastic bowl shoved in front of her face, was Martha. The elderly woman was braced against the ground, head bowed, her frail shoulders violently shuddering from silent sobs. "That's a good girl," Victoria spat, the poison practically dripping from her fangs. "That is your permanent zip code. Now eat it. Eat it like the worthless, pathetic trash you are. And thank your lucky stars I haven't tossed you in the gutter yet." Something inside Richard violently snapped. It wasn't just a hot flash of anger. It was a tectonic shift. A catastrophic earthquake in the very foundation of who he thought he was, who he thought he had married, and the entire reality he lived in. He kicked the swinging door so brutally, it smashed against the drywall with a gunshot crack that woke the entire house. "What in the actual hell is going on in my house?" His voice came out as a low, rumbling growl, packed with a homicidal chill that made Victoria physically stumble backward. Victoria whipped around, her tan instantly turning a sickly ash gray. "Richard, you're back early. I didn't, babe, this isn't what it looks like." "It's not?" He closed the distance in 3 massive strides. "Then spin it for me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like my wife is forcing a 68-year-old woman to eat off the floor like a stray dog." Martha scrambled to get up, blinded by absolute shame. desperate to crawl into a hole and die. But her dead legs refused to fire. The trauma, the sheer shock of Richard teleporting into the room, it was a total system failure. She tipped sideways, crashing toward the tile, but Richard moved faster than he ever had in his life. He caught her under the arms, hauling her up with an infinite, desperate gentleness, his own massive hands visibly shaking. "I've got you," he whispered, his tone instantly softening, completely alien to the rage he just aimed at his wife. "I'm right here. You're safe." He pulled her to her feet, and as she finally stabilized, their eyes locked. And right then, under the harsh glare of the LED kitchen lights, Richard truly looked at her for the very first time. Not the way a CEO looks at a janitor, not through that thick glass wall of corporate courtesy. He genuinely, deeply looked. There was a phantom frequency in her eyes, a terrifyingly familiar reflection that defied all logic. The slope of her nose, the exact cut of her jawline, the neurotic way she was wringing her calloused fingers together, the exact same nervous tick he did whenever the board was breathing down his neck. How the hell had he been so blind? And then, bypassing his brain entirely, driven by a raw, primal gravity that obliterated all logic, Richard pulled her in. He wrapped his arms around this frail, weeping woman, crushing her against his chest like she was the single most valuable thing left on planet Earth. "Mom?" The word ripped out of his throat in a raw, gravelly whisper, packed with total bewilderment, terrifying hope, and blinding fear all at once. Martha let out a guttural sob. She couldn't breathe. Her vocal cords paralyzed as 40 years of toxic secrets and smothered grief blew up in her chest. Shaking uncontrollably, she shoved her hand deep into her stained apron pocket. She pulled out the lifeline, the Polaroid, that decaying, yellowed snapshot she had guarded with her life for 4 decades, the only proof her baby boy had ever existed. Richard took the photo. He tilted it into the light, a newborn wrapped in a powder blue blanket. And right there, blurring in the background, was an old wrought iron crib with a highly specific, customized floral weld on the headboard. He knew that metalwork. The nuns at the foster home had grilled it into his head. They told him it was the exact crib he was sleeping in when the state dropped him off at 3 days old, swaddled in a handmade blue blanket stitched by the ghost who gave him away. The absolute truth hit him like a speeding freight train. The puzzle pieces aggressively slamming together, the terrifying mirror in her eyes, the crippling sorrow he had clocked on her face weeks ago, the way she stared at him when she thought he was distracted, not with the nervous respect of a hired maid, but with a crushing infinite gravity. Pure love, a mother's love. "You," his brain was short-circuiting. You're her." Martha nodded violently, the tears pouring off her chin and hitting the tiles. "I handed you over when you were 3 days old," she finally choked out, her voice splintering into a million pieces. "Not because I didn't want you. God knows I loved you more than my own lungs. But because I was completely empty. I had nothing but a starving stomach, a roach-infested room, and a dead-end life. So I gave you to the people who could buy you the universe." Richard's own eyes finally broke, hot tears streaming down his face. "And you put on an apron and scrubbed my floors just to be near me? I just wanted to look at you," she sobbed, completely breaking down. "I just had to see that you survived, that you won, that my horrible choice actually paid off. I never ever wanted to sabotage your life or drag my garbage past into your world." "Sabotage?" Richard's voice completely shattered. He yanked her into a crushing hug, burying his face in her shoulder like he was terrified she'd evaporate into thin air. "You are my mother, my mom. I spent 40 damn years staring at the ceiling, agonizing over who you were, why you tossed me away, wondering if you ever even thought about my face. And you were right here. You were in my house the entire time." Victoria, who had been standing there completely paralyzed by the nuclear explosion of truth, finally found her tongue. "Richard, baby, I swear on my life I had no idea. She lied to me. She's just the hired help. How was I supposed to—" "Shut your mouth!" Richard's roar was so violent it blasted Victoria backward until her spine slammed against the stainless steel fridge. He had never once raised his voice at her in 5 years of marriage. Never. But now, pivoting to lock eyes with her while keeping Martha shielded behind his back, he looked like he was ready to commit murder. "She isn't just the help. She's a human being. And even if she wasn't my flesh and blood, even if she was a total stranger off the street, Absolutely nothing excuses the sick, twisted garbage you just did to her." Victoria scrambled, her voice pitching up into a hysterical whine. "Babe, it's a massive misunderstanding. I can walk you through it." "How long?" Richard snapped his focus back to his mother, cutting Victoria off like she didn't even exist. "How long has she been running this torture chamber?" Martha dropped her gaze to the floor, physically unable to rat the woman out. But she didn't have to. The brutal timeline was permanently carved into the deep trenches on her exhausted face, in the terrified shaking of her fragile hands. Richard did the math, and the cocktail of emotions that flooded his brain went way past blind rage. It was sickening self-hatred, disgust that he had been so obsessed with his stock portfolio that he didn't realize a hostage situation was happening under his own roof. Repulsion for the sociopath he had willingly put a ring on. But above all, a crushing, devastating grief for every second his mother had burned in hell, suffering in total silence without a single person to shield her. "You are going upstairs to pack," he told Victoria, his tone totally dead, scrubbed of all emotion. "Right now. And then you are walking out of my estate, and out of my entire life." "Richard, please, no, now!" And as Victoria sprinted up the grand staircase, sobbing hysterically, Richard turned back to his mother, to the woman who had grown him in her body, who had loved him enough to rip her own heart out and give him to strangers, who had burned decades hunting him down, who had swallowed pure poison every single day just to breathe the same air as him. "Forgive me," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "Forgive me for being so blind, for not taking a bullet for you, for letting this psychopath touch you." And Martha, gripping the boy she thought she'd never touch again, whispered right back, "There is absolutely nothing to forgive, my sweet boy. Nothing. You're holding me right now. And that is the only thing I've ever prayed for." The silence that settled over the kitchen was absolute. Richard stood anchored to the floorboards, keeping his mother pulled tight against his chest, listening to Victoria's frantic, heavy footsteps tearing through the master suite upstairs. But his demons weren't satisfied. The rage hadn't evaporated. It was rapidly freezing into something cold, calculating, and ruthlessly vindictive. He gently peeled himself away from his mother, guiding her into a bar stool. "Sit down, please." His voice was velvet to her, but there was razor wire wrapped around the edges. Martha sat, completely lost, a little terrified by the dark intensity locking into her son's eyes. Richard bent down and picked up the plastic bowl on the floor, the exact bowl his wife had kicked into the dirt, expecting his mother to lap from it like a stray dog. He walked to the sink and calmly rinsed it out, every movement slow, robotic, and deadly. He walked to the massive Sub-Zero fridge, yanked the door open, and pulled out a massive slice of decadent chocolate cake, Victoria's absolute favorite, imported from a $500 a plate bakery downtown every single week. He sliced off a massive chunk, dropped it into the plastic bowl, and then, with chilling surgical precision, he placed the bowl right back onto the marble floor, directly on the exact tile it had been sitting on 10 minutes ago. Martha jumped up, her heart racing. "Richard, honey, what are you doing?" "Trust me, Mom," he ordered, his eyes locked dead on the cake on the floor. "Just let me handle this." He stalked out of the kitchen and marched up the grand staircase. He found Victoria ripping through the walk-in closet, violently shoving designer dresses into a Louis Vuitton trunk, her mascara completely blown out from panic and rage. She whipped around when he breached the doorway, eyes bloodshot. "Richard, please, we can hire a therapist, we can talk this out." "Get downstairs," he cut her off. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. The command carried the weight of a judge reading a death sentence. "Right now." "Babe, now." Victoria practically tumbled down the stairs, her knees failing, Richard trailing her like an executioner. When they hit the kitchen floor, her eyes locked onto the plastic bowl sitting on the marble, and every drop of blood abandoned her face. "No," she whimpered, backing up into the island. "No, Richard, you're psychotic, you can't." "You are going to drop to your knees," Richard instructed, his tone a flat, chilling absolute. "You're going to get in the dirt, and you're going to eat out of that bowl, in your proper place. Exactly like you forced my mother to do. The same way you mentally tortured a 68-year-old woman whose only crime was wanting to breathe the same air as her son. That is completely degrading. I am your wife. You cannot force me to do that," Victoria shrieked, totally unhinged. "You're 100% right, it's degrading." Richard crossed his arms. The exact same psychological warfare you've been running on my mother for weeks. My mother, Victoria. Did you know who she was when you put her on a leash? No, I swear to God I didn't know. And would it have mattered? Richard's explosive roar made Victoria physically flinch. If she was just some random senior citizen off the street, does that make it okay? Does that make it any less sadistic, any less evil? Victoria had nothing. She was totally cornered. Richard yanked his iPhone out and hit speed dial. Marcus, I need you and David in the main house, right now. We have a code red. Marcus was the head of the private security detail, stationed in the gatehouse on the edge of the property. Less than 90 seconds later, two massive guys in tactical black suits breached the kitchen. They quickly scanned the room, sizing up Richard, noting Victoria's hyperventilating and clocking the bizarre plastic bowl sitting on the floor. Gentlemen, Richard addressed them, his voice rebooting to that chilling boardroom calm that was infinitely more terrifying than him screaming. You're going to hold your positions, and you are going to verify that my soon-to-be ex-wife finishes her meal. From the floor, exactly like she's been forcing Martha to do. Victoria broke down into ugly, hyperventilating tears. Not manipulative crocodile tears, but raw, unfiltered panic and catastrophic humiliation. Richard, please. I'm begging you, please don't do this to me. You're going to do it, he stated, immovable as a brick wall. Or I'm dialing 911 and pressing every single criminal charge my mother has the right to file against you. Elder abuse, terroristic threats, extortion. I guarantee my staff will line up around the block to testify against you. You won't just be eating off the floor. I will drag your pristine reputation through the gutter on national television. Victoria frantically searched the room for an exit strategy, an ally, a lifeline. But the security guards were stone-faced Terminators. Richard's eyes were obsidian black, and Martha was just sitting quietly on the stool, watching the execution with a totally unreadable face. Moving in agonizing slow motion, her entire body shaking, Victoria began to sink. Her $2,000 designer slacks hit the icy tile. Her flawlessly manicured palms braced against the floor, and she lowered her face toward the plastic bowl, the toxic humiliation incinerating her ego alive. Richard, honey. Martha stood up, her voice a gentle lifeline. That's enough, please. Richard snapped his head toward his mother. He expected to see vindicated rage, but all he saw was pure mercy. Even after Victoria had dragged her through the mud, his mother's soul was still pure enough that she refused to watch her tormentor be broken. Get off the floor, he ordered Victoria. She jerked her head up, confused, massively relieved, but permanently destroyed. You aren't even worth the calories of finishing this drill. Grab your bags and get the hell off my property. Right now, my guys will physically escort you to the gate. Victoria didn't wait for a second warning. She scrambled to her feet and bolted out of the kitchen, her humiliated sobbing echoing all the way up the grand staircase. Richard stood frozen until he heard the massive oak door slam shut for the final time. Then he pivoted to his mother, and the titanium armor he wore for the world totally collapsed. He dropped to his knees right in front of her, not in submission, but in desperate prayer, and grabbed her weathered hands. I'm so sorry, he wept, pressing her knuckles to his forehead. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I was so blind to the monster living in my own house. I let her torture you when my only job was to protect you. Martha gently stroked his thick hair, her own tears falling freely now. There is zero debt to pay, my boy. You had no idea. How could you have known the script? But you're here now. You saw me. You fought for me. And that is the only thing that matters. But the hell she dragged you through is dead and buried, she interrupted softly. It's gone, and I survived it. I took every single bullet because bleeding was 1,000,000 times better than never getting to see my boy grow up, even from the shadows. Richard threw his arms around her right there on the kitchen tile, both of them completely breaking down, him from a crushing wave of guilt and relief, her from pure, unfiltered salvation. 40 years of brutal separation, of agonizing dead ends, finally dissolving in that one desperate hug. You are never scrubbing another floor in your life, he swore, pulling back to look her in the eyes. You're my mother. You're moving upstairs right now. You are the matriarch of this family. Richard, honey, you don't have to. I need this, he pleaded, cutting her off. I need this. Let me be your son. Let me buy back the 4 decades they stole from us. Please. And Martha, staring deep into the eyes of the boy she surrendered in a dark hospital room decades ago. Finally gave a gentle nod. "Okay, my sweet boy. Okay. Now I have to ask you, did Victoria get exactly what she deserved? Or did Richard cross the line? Drop your verdict down in the comments." The following months completely rewrote their reality. The divorce was a swift, bloody execution. Richard retained a shark tank of corporate lawyers, and Victoria was completely unarmed when every single maid in the mansion signed sworn affidavits detailing her psychotic abuse. She walked away with exactly what she brought into the marriage: absolutely nothing. Her country club reputation was radioactive, permanently blacklisted from every elite circle in the state. Martha moved into the VIP master suite. Richard ordered a $500,000 renovation just to customize it to her exact taste, flooding the space with warm sunlight and massive bay windows. She fought him on it at first, completely unaccustomed to anyone giving a damn about her comfort. But slowly, she let her guard down. She had to learn how to be a mom all over again. Not to a screaming infant, but to a hardened 6'2" CEO who absolutely worshipped the ground she walked on. Richard introduced her to his entire network as his mother. No hesitation, zero shame. At high-stakes galas, private board meetings, and exclusive dinners. "I'd like you to meet my mom, Martha." And the fierce, unapologetic pride radiating off his chest was blinding. On a quiet Saturday night, 6 months after that horrific, miraculous showdown, they sat down for dinner. Not at the massive mahogany table in the formal dining room, but a quiet, intimate meal at the small granite island in the kitchen, ground zero for where their new life kicked off. Richard plated her meal personally, with absolute reverence. He pulled her stool out, waited until she was perfectly comfortable, and then sat across from her. "You know," he murmured, meticulously cutting her ribeye into small pieces because he knew her arthritis flared up in the winter. "I spent my entire adult life agonizing over you, trying to figure out why you gave me up, wondering if you ever regretted it, if my face ever crossed your mind." Martha reached across the granite and gripped his wrist. "Every single day. I looked for your face in every crowd until my eyes bled. And now you're finally home." He smiled, squeezing her hand tight. "And I am dedicating the rest of my life to making damn sure nobody ever makes you feel small again. You are never, ever going to hurt again." Outside, through the massive bay windows, the wrought iron security gates stood tall. The exact same gates Victoria had been escorted out of months ago, hauling a single suitcase and the radioactive fallout of her own psychopathic arrogance. But nobody inside the walls even remembered her name. She was a ghost, permanently deleted from their reality, exactly as she deserved. Inside the fortress there was only warmth, just a mother and her boy, finally crashing back together after a lifetime of war. Officially cleared to build the memories the universe had tried so violently to steal from them. And as they ate their meal, laughing loudly over swapped stories, Martha closed her eyes and realized that yes, it was a fair trade. Every single tear, every brutal insult, every agonizing second on her knees, it was entirely worth the price of admission. To be sitting right here with her boy. To finally hear him call her mom. To finally, after 40 years of wandering in the dark, be home. This brutal journey proves that genuine humility will always slaughter toxic arrogance, and that a person's true net worth isn't found in their stock portfolio, but in how they treat the people who can offer them absolutely nothing in return. If you're addicted to dark, emotional stories that rip your heart out and force you to question what real justice looks like, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell to join our family.